The Platte River ran swift and merciless that spring afternoon, swollen with snowmelt from the distant mountains. James Colter had seen plenty of rivers in his 32 years, crossing them, camping beside them, sometimes nearly drowning in them, but he'd learned to read water the way some men read books. Today, as he guided his horse along the muddy bank, every instinct told him to stay clear. That's when he heard the scream. It pierced through the thunder of rushing water, high, desperate, unmistakably human. James didn't hesitate. He urged his mare forward, scanning the churning brown current until he spotted her, a woman in a dark dress, thrashing in the water 50 yards downstream, being pulled relentlessly toward a tangle of fallen cottonwoods that would trap her like a deadly cage. Without thinking, James kicked off his boots and dove in. The cold knocked the breath from his lungs. The current seized him immediately, spinning him like a leaf, but he'd grown up swimming in rivers like this one. He angled his body, using the flow rather than fighting it, closing the distance to the drowning woman with powerful strokes. She went under just as he reached her, and he plunged down, grabbing blindly until his fingers found fabric, then an arm, then finally got a solid grip around her waist. Breaking the surface, James fought to keep both their heads above water. The woman coughed violently, her hands clutching at him in panic, nearly pulling them both under again. "I've got you," he shouted over the roar. "Stop fighting. I've got you." Whether she heard him or simply ran out of strength, she went limp in his arms, and that made all the difference. James spotted a sandbar jutting out ahead, their only chance. He angled toward it, kicking with everything he had, feeling his muscles scream in protest. The river wanted them. It pulled and twisted, trying to drag them into the deeper channels where they'd have no chance. His boot, the one still on his right foot, scraped bottom. Then his knee hit sand. With a final surge of effort, James hauled the woman onto the narrow strip of shore, both of them collapsing in the shallow water, gasping like landed fish. For a long moment, neither could speak. James rolled onto his back, chest heaving, staring up at the vast blue Wyoming sky while his heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, the woman coughed up river water, her whole body shaking. When he finally caught his breath enough to sit up, James got his first real look at her. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with dark hair plastered to her face and gray eyes that held a mixture of terror and relief. Her black dress clung to her frame, and even in his exhausted state, James noticed the mourning clothes. A widow, then. Alone out here for reasons he couldn't fathom. "Are you hurt?" he managed to ask, his voice rough. She shook her head, but tears suddenly spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the river water. "Thank you," she whispered. "Oh God, thank you. I thought I was dead." James nodded, too tired for more words. He looked back at the river, at the deadly tangle of trees they'd narrowly missed, and felt his own hands start to shake. It had been that close. Another 30 seconds, and the river would have won. The woman was still crying, but she was alive. They both were. That, James thought, was enough for now. The woman's name was Sarah Brennan, and her homestead sat another mile upriver, a modest cabin with a sagging porch and a small barn that had seen better days. By the time they reached it, James leading his horse with Sarah wrapped in his coat, still shivering, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon. "I was trying to cross to check my traps," Sarah explained, her voice steadier now but still shaky. "The ford is usually shallow this time of year, but the horse spooked at something. He threw me right into the current and bolted. I couldn't. I'm not a strong swimmer, and the water was so cold, and I just—" "You don't have to explain," James said gently. "River doesn't need a reason to kill. It just does what water does." Inside the cabin, Sarah immediately set about building up the fire while James tended to his mare outside. The homestead showed signs of hard times, fence rails that needed mending, a vegetable garden struggling against the weeds, winter damage to the roof that hadn't been repaired. A woman's work, all of it, and too much for one person alone. When James came back inside, Sarah had changed into dry clothes, a simple brown dress, her dark hair now loose around her shoulders. She'd set coffee on to boil and was pulling out what looked like the makings of a meal from her meager supplies. "Please, sit," she insisted. "It's the least I can do. You saved my life, Mr. Colter. James Colter. And you don't owe me anything, ma'am." "Sarah," she corrected, managing a small smile. "And yes, I do. Everything, in fact." As they sat at her rough-hewn table, drinking coffee strong enough to strip paint, Sarah's story emerged in bits and pieces. Her husband had died 6 months ago, pneumonia that had taken him in less than a week. They'd only been married 2 years, had been trying to build something out here, away from the crowded eastern cities where they'd both grown up. Now she was alone, trying to hold on to the land they'd claimed together, fighting against odds that grew longer every day. "I keep thinking I should give up," Sarah admitted quietly, staring into her cup. "Sell what I can, go back east. But this place, we dreamed it together, you know. Thomas and I. Every nail in this cabin, every seed in that garden. Leaving feels like losing him all over again." James understood that kind of attachment. He'd been drifting since the war ended, since he'd come home to find his own family's ranch sold off to pay debts. Some losses you could never quite leave behind. "The river today," Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Part of me wonders if I wasn't being as careful as I should have been. If maybe I was tired of fighting." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and honest. James had seen that look before, in soldiers' eyes during the war, the exhaustion of people who'd been strong for too long. "But you fought," he said simply. "When you were in that water, you fought to live. That counts for something." Sarah looked up at him, and something in her expression shifted, surprise, maybe, or recognition. "You're right," she whispered. "I did, didn't I?" As darkness fell fully outside, Sarah stood to light the lamps, and James noticed her wince as she moved, one hand going to her side. She'd been hurt in the river after all, probably bruised ribs from being battered against rocks. She was hurting, exhausted, and still trying to play host to the stranger who'd pulled her from death's grasp. "You should rest," James said, standing. "I'll bed down in the barn, head out at first light." "No," Sarah said quickly, then caught herself, a flush rising to her cheeks. "I mean, it's going to be cold tonight, and the barn has holes in the roof. You'd freeze." She hesitated, then met his eyes directly. "There's a spare room. Thomas's brother was supposed to come help with the spring planting, so we built it for him. He never came." James heard the loneliness in those last 3 words. He understood it intimately. "I don't want to impose," he said carefully. "You're not." Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. "Do you know what it's like, Mr. Colter? To be alone out here? Days go by without seeing another soul. I talk to the chickens just to hear a voice, even if it's my own. Today, when I was in that river, I thought, this is how it ends. Alone. Forgotten. Gone like I never existed." She turned back to him, and in the lamplight, James could see tears glistening in her eyes again. "You gave me my life back today," Sarah continued. "But more than that, you gave me something I'd almost forgotten, proof that there's still kindness in this world. That I'm not as alone as I thought." She took a shaky breath. "Please stay. At least for tonight. I need to not be alone tonight." There was nothing improper in her words, nothing suggestive, only raw, honest human need. James had been a drifter long enough to recognize the difference. This wasn't seduction. This was survival of a different kind. "I'll stay," he said quietly. Relief washed over Sarah's face, and she nodded gratefully. They finished their simple meal in comfortable silence, and then Sarah stood to clear the dishes. But as she reached for James's plate, she suddenly swayed, her hand going to her head. James jumped up, steadying her. You're exhausted. Leave this. Go rest. I'm fine, Sarah protested weakly, but her face had gone pale. No, you're not. You nearly drowned today. Your body needs to recover. He guided her gently toward the door to what he assumed was her bedroom. Go. Sleep. I'll clean up here. Sarah looked up at him, and something complex flickered across her face. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something that looked like the beginning of trust. Will you stay if I undress? She asked suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. James froze, not understanding at first. Then he saw the way she was holding her side, the way her breathing had gone shallow. You're hurt worse than you said. My ribs, Sarah admitted. And my shoulder. I think I hit rocks. The corset makes it hard to breathe deep, but I can't. She gestured helplessly at the back of her dress, at the buttons she couldn't reach with her injured shoulder. Understanding flooded through James, along with relief. This wasn't what he'd feared, some desperate proposition born of gratitude and loneliness. This was simpler and somehow more profound, a woman asking for help from another human being, trusting him with her vulnerability. I'll help, he said simply. Then you rest, and I'll be right outside if you need anything. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. For seeing me as a person, not something else. James didn't sleep much that night. He lay in the small spare room, listening to the wind whistle through gaps in the cabin walls, thinking about Sarah in the next room, about loneliness and loss, about the random chance that had put him on that riverbank at exactly the right moment. He thought about his own drifting, the way he'd been moving from place to place since the war, never settling, never putting down roots. What was he running from? Or was he just too tired, like Sarah, to keep fighting for something that felt real? When dawn broke, James rose and stepped quietly into the main room. He built up the fire, started coffee, and was surprised to find eggs and bacon in Sarah's larder. He set about making breakfast, figuring it was the least he could do. Sarah emerged from her room looking better, rested, though still moving carefully. She stopped in the doorway, staring at him in surprise. You're still here, she said softly. Said I would be. I know, but... She shook her head. Most men would have left. Or would have wanted something in return for staying. James poured her coffee. I'm not most men. They ate breakfast as the sun rose fully, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink. Through the window, James could see the work that needed doing, the fence rails, the garden, the barn roof. Weeks of work, at least. Maybe months. I could stay on a few days, he heard himself say. If you'd like. Help with some repairs. Sarah looked up sharply. I can't pay you. Didn't ask for pay. You've got room and board. That's enough. Why? The question was direct, her gray eyes searching his face. Why would you do that? James thought about it, really thought about it. Because I've been drifting too long, he said finally. Because this morning, waking up in a real bed, in a real home, making breakfast for someone who needed it, it felt like the first real thing I've done in years. He met her eyes. Because maybe we're both tired of being alone. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. Then she smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her whole face. A few days would be wonderful, she said. Thank you, James. Those few days became a week. The week became 2. James repaired the fence, fixed the barn roof, helped plant the garden. Sarah cooked meals that grew more substantial as she gained strength and confidence. They talked in the evenings, about their pasts, their losses, their uncertain futures. And slowly, something neither of them had been looking for began to grow. 3 months later, when the traveling preacher came through, James Colter and Sarah Brennan stood together in that small cabin and made promises to each other. Not born of desperation or gratitude, but of something deeper, two broken people who'd found each other in the current and chosen to build something real together. "You stayed," Sarah whispered during their first dance as husband and wife, there in their small cabin with just the preacher and two neighbors as witnesses. "I'll always stay," James replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The river still ran swift and merciless outside, indifferent to human joy or sorrow. But inside, two people who'd nearly been lost to its current had found their way to shore, together. And that made all the difference.